There you go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd Annual Conference of the Association for Heterodox Economics. My name is Ingrid Kwan-Graven, and I'm in the AHE Management Committee. So this session is on anti-colonial and post-colonial development. Part of this session is being recorded, but only the video and the audio of the panelists is being recorded. So all of you attendees are on mute without video. To ask questions, please click on the Q&A box you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So the panelists will answer the questions submitted through that function, and you can also upvote questions. So if you see someone else asking a question that you're interested in, you can vote for it, and then we'll pick the questions at the end that are most popular. And keep the questions short. We'll take all the questions at the end, and also mention who your question is meant for, if it's meant for a specific panelist rather than a general question. So I have Eurydice Fotopolo with me as a tech support. So if you have any problems with the technical aspects of the webinar, you can ask in the chat. So use the chat function to mention any technical problems, and then use the Q&A box for any sort of substantial questions for the panelists. And those of you who are on Twitter, you can find us on AHE 2020. Feel free to tweet about the session. And I'm here today with Max Agil and Ibrahim Shikaki and Divya Sharma. And they will present in that order, 20 minutes each, and we'll have a Q&A discussion at the end. But yeah, feel free to start putting your questions in as they're speaking. So I'll hand it over now to Max to also present the session a little bit, because this is actually a session organized by Max, Ibrahim, and Divya themselves. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Max.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to you and to the rest of the organizers for pulling together this conference. It's been fantastic. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So this panel is about, very broadly, post-colonial or anti-colonial theories of development. And we wanted to put together some presentations that would actually both draw implicitly or explicitly on traditions associated with or parallel to dependency theory, and that would speak concretely to the developmental problems that emerged in the current or former third world during the process of decolonization or during the ongoing process of anti-colonial resistance. And so this involves actually mapping the overall structure of past or present colonialism, and in turn surveying some of the attempts that have been made from the regions themselves to analyze what was going on and think about what that might imply for mechanisms of resistance to what's going on. So I am both offering a kind of general survey or introduction to the problematics we're dealing with, and then going into my own specific presentation, which is about North African and specifically Tunisian agriculture and heterodox theories of rural development. So I will first be introducing the panel, which largely I already did, and then I will be discussing modernization theory, dependency theory, and as methodology, and what that means more concretely in our three discrete colonial contexts of Palestine, Tunisia, and India, thinking about mechanisms as historical processes, thinking about the overall problematic of breaking from underdevelopment or, in the case of Palestine, de-development, and then going on to the specific Tunisian solutions that were proposed, and then situating them or interpreting them as an epistemological revolution in theories of development. So this will probably be the most well-known, which is modernization theory and how it conceived of the world as a series of linear steps that the so-called traditional economies or the underdeveloped countries had to pass through in order to arrive at modernity. Modernity was conceived essentially as a model derived from the European and US economies. And because it was a model derived from essentially from those economies as they presented themselves to economists or sociologists or historians in the 1950s and 1960s, they erased the colonial and settler colonial experiences and just kind of derived this model based, a stylized model that erased many of the historical experiences that we want to foreground in these presentations. So dependency theory, which was arrived at in various forms independently in the Arab world and Africa, first off by Samir Amin in 1957, and he is the most influential for Tunisian dependency theory. And then there were parallel strands, some of which developed in India and out of the Tunisian the Indian anti-colonial movement, which Divya will pick up on. And then of course, there's the most well-known, which is the Latin American strand of dependency theory. What they sought was to actually historicize both the northern and southern experience of capitalist development, and to put it into history and to show that there had actually been a global processes which had constituted the peripheries or constituted the colonial countries as underdeveloped. So it wasn't, switched away from an endogenous account of underdevelopment to a world systemic or implicitly or explicitly account of underdevelopment, in which underdevelopment was something that was actually and actively constituted by the more dominating or colonizing or imperialist countries. And so what that meant was that they also focused very much on the mechanisms that made underdevelopment, that if this was a historical process, it also involved a series of economic or political mechanisms and processes which accounted for those historical processes. And again, this will be something we will each develop as they apply to the regions or the countries we're dealing with, and both under the settler colonial, the colonial, or the neo-colonial periods. But some of those mechanisms include the colonial drain theory, which was, of course, most famously developed in India, but was also, in fact, learned the Tunisian nationalist movement, learned from that theorization and started to apply it to its own historical experience. There were theories of disarticulation, which were developed in India and later on also in Tunisia. There were processes of settler colonialism or occupation, which occurred most of all in Palestine, but also in Tunisia. And these could also be easily interpreted as processes of primitive accumulation and alienation of the land base. And later on, during the neo-colonial period, there were much more marked processes of technological and financial dependency. And some of this is, of course, what we analyze and what we survey attempts to kind of prophylactically avoid in the case of Divya, or to respond to and transcend in some of what I am working on in Tunisia. And of course, all of these are tied into accumulation on a global scale through global wage suppression, which is an important mechanism through which peripheries are tied to cores. So in terms of breaking from underdevelopment, and this is just kind of to introduce what I think is the pithiest way this was formulated by any theorist of anti-colonial national liberation, is what the agronomist, and I think it's actually very important that he was an agronomist, Amilcar Cabral, who was also a leader of the national liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau. And what he pointed out was that what this meant was, what national liberation meant was not merely a process of the reacquisition of political sovereignty from the imperialists, It was in fact the process of the liberation of the process of development of the national productive forces, meaning women and manpower, meaning land, meaning what was produced on the land, meaning a process implicitly of sovereign industrialization, meaning that people will be free to choose the appropriate mode of life. And I think this is important to bring in precisely because a lot of the post-colonial literature, or even more the critiques of the post-colonial literature, from both far right and far left, eliminate the kind of materialist component of national liberation and reduce it to a pure process of the reacquisition of political sovereignty. Whereas it was very much the common argot of the national liberation forces in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s, that this was actually also a material process of the reacquisition of control over land. And it was very much tied to tariffs. It was tied to economic liberation. It was tied to technological freedom of technological development, very much not just under the influence of China, but China was very important, although there were also elements that prefigured China or that just carried, went along their own paths in India especially, which is what Divya is going to develop. So it's very important and informs a lot of this these interpretations and work that there was a material emphasis to what was going on. So what was sought in now kind of zeroing in more on what was going on in North Africa, Tunisia, and India is that both pre and post national liberation, there were models that sought to work and build up from existing strengths, and above all, to build up from the ancestral, inherited, and accreted knowledges and technologies of peasant and artisanal agriculture and artisanal production. And it's a big emphasis on technology because very often we are trained to think of technology as something that involves metal. And in fact, technology is a kind of interface between humans and the surrounding environment based on applied knowledge and a material, in some form of material implement. And so, of course, agriculture is essentially the first and was the most developed technology for most of human settled civilization, or even before, depending on how one interprets it. So I think this is very important, is that we rethink of technology as including very much the agricultural sphere, which then allows us to think of building up agriculture as essential to a process of popular and sovereign development. And it's very important that this was also based on notions of technological self-reliance. And again, this was before the Maoist or Chinese experience exploded onto the world stage, but especially in Tunisia, the Maoist experience was a touchstone and an inspiration, especially because they were kind of in the shadow of neo-colonialism and wanted to break from it, and it helped them see that it was possible and what it could look like. And finally, this was seldom to the exclusion of modern metallurgy and large-scale technology, but it was often thinking of that not as an end in itself, but as a component of a sovereign industrialization. So endogenous development was considered and kind of denied in Tunisia during the decades of development. There was an alternative planning matrix starting in the 1950s, and then it continued to kind of be embryonic in the 1960s. It was largely headed off by the large farmers, but there was a kind of continued process of alternative or heterodox developmental policy in one way or another, influenced often indirectly or directly by China. So Gerard Destin de Bernice, who was the head of one of these ministries that was contracting with the Tunisian government, worked under Francois Perroux, who was also the supervisor of Samir Amin, and he had made visits to China, and this informed his planning policies. Gilbert Nakash and Salahuddin al-Amami, Amami is who I'm going to focus on in the latter half of this presentation, were students of René Dumont, and he was very much inspired by the Chinese experience. They were also, by the late 1960s and 1970s, they were essentially dissenting from the Green Revolution and the larger milieu within which the Green Revolution was taking place, which was basically based on just investing massive amounts of capital into agriculture, whether that was going to be mechanization, whether that was going to be dams, which constituted half of the state's agricultural research budget. And they thought that this was not a correct way to proceed. Salahuddin al-Amami was a former leftist activist, the illegalized leftist group, worked with Nakash and the Tunisian Ministry of Agriculture, and then headed the alternative research group within the Department of Agriculture. And he was deeply, although somewhat subtly, influenced by dependency theory and Maoism, and also he very much built off the Chinese experience. What he was above all critical of was the contempt for the peasantry, which he thought animated Tunisian mainstream agricultural development, which had been developed kind of hand in tractor with the American agricultural research institutions, the USAID, American Department of State, all the agricultural research institutions in the core, which had really had an overweening influence on Tunisian planning. What he wanted to make very clear is that they had actually demonized the essential mechanisms or the essential base, a sovereign base of knowledge, which could have been the basis for a totally alternative theory of development in Tunisia. And that all the schools of engineers, the academy, all of this had worked to demonize the existing knowledges that had actually existed in Tunisia and tried to kind of turn it into a tabula rasa in order to then impose modes of thinking which had been developed in the north and would then facilitate northern plunder of Tunisia. And what he sought was to fight against that. And he pointed out that part of this was the way schooling kind of made cities normative instead of having appropriate rural-urban balances, that modernization meant a specific kind of modernization, which was to erase and he meant this sarcastically, surpass the traditional ways of managing natural resources. And he discussed that very little was preserved by the late 1970s. As he wrote in the early 1980s, there was, had been a pre-existing system, which actually is still extant today, of existing traditional technologies in irrigation, that in contrast to the large dams were based on the local know-how, materials, and relative independence of the central authorities. So these were essentially autonomous, they were popularly controlled, and he suggested, or would state more explicitly elsewhere, that these were actually the basis for a decentralized model of development based on building off of peasant strengths. And in contrast to the large dams, these systems were actually based on recharging the groundwater, and they enabled recharging of the water table, and that they were kind of smoothly fitted into the ecology rather than the large dams, which prevented the recharge of the water table and therefore severely damaged the water cycle. Something else that he worked on alongside one of his collaborators were developing regional agricultural plans so that were decentralized and were based on the mobilization of the creative will of the peasants. Again, in this way, you can really see the influence of the Chinese model that was very much based, as we are now learning somewhat retrospectively, is that very much based on actually building up from the peasant capacity of self-reliant development, which was in the Chinese model was based on village-based development very often, and that was based on building up from people's actual local knowledge or local capacity, local skills, working with local materials and local ecologies, and that actually the actual planning process which came from the state should be soldered onto those existing capacities rather than a new edifice that was kind of plopped on top of them, and that would in turn level them. I think one of the most kind of interesting and prescient ideas is he conceived of the idea of using renewable energy technology already in the 1980s. And part of this was kind of solar powered drip irrigation. And he saw very immediately that, that there was a kind of elective affinity between decentralized irrigation or decentralized energy technologies and decentralized and people-centered forms of development, that because these forms were diffuse, they could also allow for diffusion of population and diffusion of living patterns, and therefore diffusion of political power, which would, of course, prevent this kind of rural flight and allow for a rural-urban balance, which is, again, something we see prefigured, or we see emerging organically, of course, in India, but also became most famous in the Chinese example. And I think one of these was a solar power drip irrigation, where when the sun was shining, it would actually power the solar powered wells, and then they would produce drip irrigation. When the sun wasn't shining, you didn't need to withdraw from the water table, and therefore they wouldn't be powered, and therefore they would kind of work with the ecology.
5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm on my last slide. And so in conclusion, I think what is significant here is not only the specific forms of technology, although they are extremely significant and still speak very much to Tunisian developmental impasses. And a lot of these forms of technology, for example, the hillside dams and the various forms of irrigation in the drier arid regions, the land races of barley and also hard wheat, the varieties of olives, the varieties of dates. So both the technology and also the actual species, which were a continued archive for development in the past and still are in the present and could be in the future, also constituted an epistemological revolution, which in fact went even further in some ways than what was going on in China, and was, I think, was probably the state of the art in terms of agronomic heterodox development, or this specific development of dependency theory, and actually put this form of knowledge center stage as the key or keystone for an entirely different form of development than we have thus seen in most of the post-colonial world. So thank you very much, and I am done, and we will hear our next presentations now.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting and kept so well to time. Amazing. So next up we have Ibrahim Shikaki. Floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to start timing myself. Ingrid, you can jump in on that 5-minute mark. Okay, so let me share. Just double check everybody can see this?
Yeah.
All right. So let me just put this on the side. So thank you, Max, for that. I guess this paper is more of an application in terms of dependency theory, particularly when talking about Palestine. The title, Political Economy of the Israeli Occupation, this is a presentation based on a paper that is going to be published in an edited book on the political economy of Palestine and Israel. The editors are Ala Tartir and Tariq Dana. And really what I'm going to cover here is basically two things, right? So just to, put you in gear here, I have 3 introductory slides. So for those who are not familiar with the area, what do I mean when I say the Palestinian economy? I have a slide, only one, about the shortcomings of neoclassical economics. And then what I mean by dependency in the Palestinian-Israeli context. So hopefully first 10 minutes, a little bit less than that, we'll talk about those introductory slides. And then the other part really, which is kind of the core really of the presentation, is divided also into 2 parts, and it's chronological. So the first is the first 25 years of the occupation, 1967 till 1993, what I call the structural distortions of the Israeli occupation. This is when Israeli colonization occupation really entrenched what I call the dependency relationship between those 2 economies. And then finally, that second part is really about new dependencies. After 1994, the political process took place and the Palestinian Authority really was established. And so I talk about new dependencies, particularly, I think Max mentioned a little bit, I talk about more about the financial aspects of these dependencies. So what I mean when I say the Palestinian economy really is the economy of, I hope you can see the mouse really, the West Bank right over here and the Gaza Strip. So, you know, 30-second history lesson, this area over here, all this area is what we call Mandate Palestine. It was the area that was under British mandate from 1918 to 1948. In 1948, this area in dark gray became the state of Israel, right? And what happened then is that the majority of people who were living there, 800,000 Palestinians, became refugees in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and a little bit in Egypt. So the people, the Palestinians who were living in the West Bank were administratively under Jordan. The people who were living in the Gaza Strip were administratively under Egypt. What happened in 1967 is the colonization of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, right? So those are the areas that we call the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem here, that was only colonized and occupied after 1967. And for our purposes, that is what we call the Palestinian economy. Just a quick, few numbers if you want to take a look. The population is a small and very young population. Not surprisingly, if you don't know anything about this, it won't be surprising after a few minutes, right? Poverty rate is very high, around 30%. Unemployment for the last 10, 15 years has been around 25 to 30%. And in terms of economic activity, contribution to GDP and output, really, you see I've kind of dissected services, but it is wholesale and retail trade that is really on the top there. Then you have a few other economic activities. But again, this is just to give you an idea about what I mean when I say the Palestinian economy and what that looks like. Obviously, one slide is not enough to talk about the shortcomings of neoclassical economics. What I'm trying to say here is that in the context of Palestine, Israel, why it is particularly insufficient as a tool of analysis, basically because neoclassical economics says, well, listen, if you have two economies that are close to each other, if you have a strong and a poor, right, a rich and a weak economy that are close to each other, that proximity basically will lead to a dispersion of positive effects. Even those, and I call this mainstream theory, but this is really Myrdal, who is actually critiquing, orthodox theory, right? There's spread effects that are good effects and there are backwash effects, but mainly neoclassical economics says that these spread effects, these good effects, are really what dominate. They're what trump over any backwash effects. Obviously, if you look at the Palestinian economy in the last 60, 70 years, that has not been the case. So what I argue, this is definitely not me. I have a lot of people who argue or who complain to me that, there are a lot of Palestinians who write about political economy, and I always tell them, you're just lazy and looking. I mean, people have been really writing about political economy and dependency theory for a very long time. I mean, in the 70s, sociologists like Jamil Hilal and Ilya Zurek were writing about political economy. In the 80s, Yusuf Saigh and Adel Samara particularly were talking about dependency theory. Recently, you have Leila Farsakh and Linda Tabar and Samia Boutme and Fadl Naqib and Tawfiq Haddad and Adam Haniya and many, many others. So, I have my email on the first slide. If you want to talk about that, I can tell you more about that. But what I'm arguing is that if you want a framework that actually addresses the historical and political angles, then you should rely on dependency theory. And I mean, Ingrid is here and she's written extensively about dependency theory, and I encourage everybody to read a lot of what she's done about this. There are different strands and different approaches. Really what I take out of dependency is the dynamic of movement of resources and goods. For me, this is really key. When I try and I look at the Palestinian-Israeli relationship and I see this kind of very much textbook dependency relationship. So what do I mean by the dynamics of movements? Well, on the one hand, you have the movement of resources from that periphery, the Palestinian economy, to the center. So resources can be natural resources, right? Land, water, minerals. But mostly what I'm going to talk about is human resources. So actually the movement of labor from the periphery to the center. On the other hand, you have the movement of final goods on the opposite direction, right? Movement from the Israeli to the Palestinian economy. What I'm arguing here is that what this actually leads to. I mean, it doesn't actually lead to, it's more kind of dialectical, but what happened is that you lock that periphery in a vicious cycle where A, it cannot develop its productive base. As a result, it increases its trade deficit and it really remains dependent on both the labor and good markets of that center. And that's basically what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. So I have 13 more minutes to talk about these kind of chronologically two distinct times. The first, what I'm calling structural distortions, really the first 20, 25 years of the occupation. I have graphs and I'm hopefully going to be talking about them. So 5 graphs for each part. So I'll start by talking about this idea of self-employment, right? In 1967, when the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip happened, basically 50% of Palestinians were self-employed in agriculture, right? What happened to them basically is something similar to what, you know, Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. But instead of these neoliberal kind of privatization, what you had is confiscation of land. Because of the opening of the Palestinian-Israeli economies, the price level and costs increased. So basically those people, petty bourgeois, self-employed in agriculture, artisans and workshops, were not able to bear those costs, and they basically were proletarized, right? That is the proletarization of a large segment of the Palestinian labor force. And basically what Marx said, you know, people who only have their labor, right? They don't have any capital goods anymore. They only have their labor to sell. And so what I'm doing here in this graph, and this is the only graph I assure you, I promise, that has 2 scales. But what I'm trying to show you here is that connection between wage labor and work in Israel. So on the left, we have the percentage of people in the labor force who are working in Israel. It goes from around 5% in the early days of the occupation up until 40%, right around the first Intifada in 1987. If you look at wage labor, right, so these are not self-employed, and these are not the small 5% who are what we call unpaid family members. These are wage workers, right? That also increased from around 45% in the beginning of the occupation up until around 67 or 68%. So basically, this is the type of relationship that has happened with confiscation of land, with the inability of these people to you know, continue the type of work that they had. They basically only had the possibility to work in Israel. And what that meant, unfortunately, is that after 20, 30 years, all these people who were working in Israel, basically the labor market in the Palestinian labor market became dependent on the Israeli market. So this graph I really like because it's only one scale, but it's showing you 2 variables. That solid black line is the percentage of unemployment, the unemployment rate in the Palestinian economy. And that dashed gray line right over here is the percentage of work in Israel. So it's almost like you have an inverse relationship. If Palestinians are allowed to work in the Israeli economy, there's very low unemployment. If you have less opportunities right here, specifically after 2000, then you have very high level of unemployment. So this is basically what's going on. After those first 20, 25 years of the occupation, the Palestinian labor market became dependent on opportunities to work in Israel. If we didn't have that, and by all means, that's not the only reason why you have very high unemployment, but it's a very strong correlation between those two. The thing is that it's not only that you depend on them in terms of working there, but what type of work do you do? So now the labor force is morphed in order to adapt to what the Israeli economy needs, right? So if you look here, all around for the first 25, 30 years of the occupation, the vast majority of Palestinian workers in Israel, right, more than 50% all the time, and up to 75% in the early 90s, when a huge wave of Jewish people from a former Soviet Union came, right, are working in construction. So the majority of Palestinians, what Israel needs, you have influx of Jewish people coming from all around the world to Israel. They need construction. There's a construction boom. Palestinians are there to provide that. It is not only that the Palestinian, and I'm focusing on Palestinian labor in Israel, but it's not just in Israel. It's also you're working in and for the Israeli economy. And what I mean by that, by working for the Israeli economy, this graph shows you domestically, right, the Palestinian economy itself. In terms of employment, what are the sectors that employ the most? So if you look first 2-3 years of the occupation, agriculture and services both employ around 40% of Palestinian labor. What has happened afterwards is that agriculture has gone down for all the reasons that we mentioned before, but also services is going up. And there's a particular, and you would actually need to dissect this, there's a particular service sector that's going up, and that's trade and transportation. Trade and transportation of what? Of Israeli goods. So not only are our labor working in the Israeli economy now morphed to what they need, but even the domestic economy is built on that. Manufacturing is one thing that's very interesting. Again, somebody might see, hey, this is manufacturing. It's actually been the same. Well, in terms of the percentage, yes, but also the majority of this manufacturing that is happening after the occupation is actually subcontracting, right? Mostly in textiles. So what you have, towns like Tulkarem, where I'm from, that's very close to the Green Line, you have basically Israelis bringing intermediate goods or raw material to mostly women who are working in textile, being paid poverty wages for them to work and then bring them back. So that manufacturing is also needs a little bit of dissecting. So what does this lead to? We only talked about the labor market. What about the goods market? Well, that's the flip side of the coin, right? My very technical equation over here. If you have purchasing power from working in Israel, you don't have any productive base for all the reasons that we just mentioned, then what you have basically is more imports and more trade deficit. And that's exactly what you see here. Those black bars are imports going up. And what's increasing over here is basically the trade deficit, right? And again, even this is misleading because you see these points are supposedly exports, but a lot of these exports are not finalized goods. And that really matters, especially for those who are interested in where value added is actually occurring. So a very quick summary of those first 25 years, Palestinian economy became completely dependent on both the labor and good market. How? Half of the labor force worked either in or for the Israeli economy, which became the undisputed trade partner. So it's not only that we have a trade deficit, the number that I didn't mention is that 80% of trade activity for the Palestinian economy is actually with the Israeli economy. Something that I don't talk a lot about in this presentation, but it's part of my paper, is also about class formation and transformation. So what happened in those first 25 years that I did actually mention here a little bit, is that prevalent petty bourgeois class was basically unable to bear those increasing costs, occupation policies of all the military orders that really limited any type of economic activities, and they were forced basically to go work in wage labor in Israel. The second part, this is kind of like the last part of the presentation, right? I know I have 5 minutes in good now, is basically the new dependency. So after the political process in the early 90s, after the Palestinian Authority was established, Israel, the responsibility of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, basically de facto became the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. That was transferred to the Palestinian Authority. Unfortunately, natural resources, borders, control over policies, none of that was transferred. So the Palestinian Authority was left, whether it liked it or not, with a huge financial burden. And the only way to deal with that was with international aid. So you had a conference in 1996 in Paris, and another one in 2007 in Paris. This is the international aid that was in current prices. This huge jump here that you might see is because this is the year when Salam Fayyad, who is somebody who has worked both in the World Bank and the IMF, he was the finance minister and then became prime minister, somebody trusted by the international community became prime minister. And so there was an influx of aid. In 2009, I think Palestine had one of the highest per capita international aid in the world at that time. Now, it's not only that we had international aid, but international aid failed in terms of these new dependencies. You know, Matthias Ronaldo talks about this dependency on the international financial system. So you have this international aid on the one side, but it has failed to basically, you know, what Keynes would call to push for the animal spirits, right? If you look at what we call gross fixed capital formation, right? Another word for investment in national accounts, the majority of that in the Palestinian economy has been in buildings. That's what we invest in. So there hasn't been really any push for investment that is creating jobs and creating employment. So this figure is gross fixed capital formation since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority up until 3-4 years. The black part of the bar is buildings. That's where investment went to around 70, maybe up to 80% most of the years. And the non-building part of investment really is only a portion of that. So even with all of that international aid, really, there hasn't been a push for investment to actually play a role. Now, the other type of new dependency after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority really is establishment on credit facilities. So if you look, even after the second Intifada in 2000, very little opportunities to work in Israel, very high unemployment, and yet consumption is still high. Palestinians are still consuming, and they're still importing. How does that happen? Well, it happens through debt, right? You go to banks, you get money so you can get a car and you can get those consumption goods. That's exactly what happened. Again, 2007 is when Salam Fayyad, that prime minister, World Banker, IMF guy, becomes prime minister. This is what happened. There was also a law that changed at that time. And this is what happened to total credit facilities. Again, there's nothing wrong with credit. The failure of credit is where that credit goes to. So I have 2 years that I've chosen for you, 2007, when Salam Fayyad became prime minister, in 2013. And basically what I want you to look at is this part. But I mean, if you look at end year, it's always going to be the same. Almost 1/3 of credit basically goes to cars and consumption goods, right? If you go number 2, that might be general trade. So again, we're talking about trade. We're just basically talking about trading with Israeli products. I mean, recently a little bit, it has been diversified, but that's it. And construction. If you think of what we call the productive base, if we're talking about agriculture and manufacturing, it's minute. It's 5%, 6%. For manufacturing, around 1% for agriculture. What does that lead to? So that was, you know, what we're having in the new dependencies, just more trade deficit, right? So even with that trade deficit increasing the first 25 years, I know we saw that increasing, but that is nothing compared to, you know, again, this is neoliberalism, this is the PA international aid, whatever you want to call it, but this is basically what has been happening to the trade deficit. Now, small spike over here is trade deficit going down, but that's because it was the first few years of the Intifada and destruction and closure of borders and what. So again, I'm done with time. The summary of that last part, and this is my last slide, that most of the structural distortions that were created in those first 25 years remained, they persisted, and they would actually become worse after the year 2000, second Intifada. But moreover, that dependency relationship now only became in one direction. So Israel got over Palestinian labor, it doesn't need us anymore. It got labor from elsewhere. Right now it has from Eastern Europe and from Thailand or from other places. It has immigrated labor, right? But we still rely on the labor market. We have still 80 to 90% of our trade is with Israel, but Israel has gotten over us in terms of its relationship. So now you have this dependency. Never was it a two-way relationship, because we understand what we mean by dependency, but in the sense of the relationship of the labor and goods market, that is only now one way. You have these new types of dependencies that I mentioned on international aid and private credit. And while I did not talk about this, one thing that was very clear in terms of class transformation is that you had the rise of this new professional middle class. Part of it has to do with NGOs that I'm sure is similar all around the world and the Arab world, but also this arrival of a segment of Palestinian capital from the Gulf countries. Adam Hani has written, you know, wonderful work, a book and a couple of articles on this if you're interested in this. So again, that's my part of the presentations. I hope somebody asks me in the Q&A, so what? Because I didn't have time to say so what. But you know, again, I'm arguing that this is a better way to understand the relationship between the Palestinian-Israeli economy and what the Palestinian economy is. And the next question should be, well, okay, so what? So thank you, and I'm a minute and a half late. Sorry, Ingrid. And sorry, Divya.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. And thank you for the encouragement to ask questions. So I'll put that over to the attendees. While Divya is talking, if you have any questions for Max and Ibrahim, feel free to put them into the Q&A box. I see someone already started putting questions in there, and then we'll discuss them after Divya's presentation. But yeah, Divya, Sharma, you're next.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, and talk about the early part of the 20th century. So mostly really centered on rural reconstruction and a different model of agrarian development as being central to the broader sort of development planning. So just to quickly sort of outline what I'm going to focus on, I'll start by talking a little bit about the background and context of this work, which is rooted more in the kind of contemporary politics of agroecology struggles in India, and a critique of the Green Revolution, which was, since the 1960s, India, partly under pressures from American intervention, adopted a particular model of agrarian transformation, which focused on monocultures and adopting sort of very chemical intensive forms of agriculture that involved a strategy of betting on the strong regions in terms of particularly irrigated lands, and also a strategy that primarily benefited medium and large landowning farmers, but then subsequently smallholding farmers were also kind of forced to adopt or buy into that model of very high input capital intensive form of farming. So this is sort of the background for this work, which actually then focuses on the early development planning debates in India. Like I said, in the period of, sort of early 20th century, and which involved a critique of colonial underdevelopment, deindustrialization in particular, and proposed alternative forms of agrarian centered and rural centered development that emerged already within the anti-colonial nationalist movement. And the way I'm going to sort of do this is primarily by focusing on three figures and their work, slightly different from each other, but quite aligned in terms of the kinds of principles and practices they advocated for. So the first one is Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who was a social scientist, economist, and sociologist, primarily occupying academic positions in the 1920s and 30s, but also was quite active in the nationalist movement. The second figure is J.C. Kumarappa, who became sort of really well known for propagating what is now called Gandhian economics, and was an active leader in the nationalist movement, was an important voice in development debates after independence, was a critique of Nehruvian sort of socialist planning that emphasized heavy industries. And then finally, if I have time, I'm briefly going to touch on another figure, R.H. Richarya, who's actually a rice scientist and agronomist who in the 1960s was sort of proposing a agronomy research agenda, which kind of aligns with the political thinking of people like Kumarappa. Okay. So like I said, this work is sort of primarily animated by contemporary agroecology movements and their critique of extractive model of agricultural development in India, and its consequences both in terms of deepening inequality and ecological degradation. And And so sort of going back to these kind of what we can now call alternative trajectories of post-colonial development that were proposed but was sort of never realized, and looking at the process both of how they were foreclosed in a sense, is I think a useful exercise, because these alternative visions have kind of been erased from our histories of agrarian green revolution and agrarian transformation, not just in sort of accounts that celebrate the green revolution as a success, but also critical accounts that for the large part sort of focused more on the kind of impacts of the green revolution, but we don't really hear a lot about the alternative imaginaries that did kind of exist. So in a way, this is an attempt to answer what Raj Patel has suggested as being a key question, which is not what would have happened had the Green Revolution not occurred, but rather what might have happened had the substantial resources that were used in the Green Revolution been deployed in a different way. So sort of starting with the anti-colonial nationalist movement before independence, Manu Goswami has argued that a lot of the foundations and normative categories of the nationalist developmental framework were kind of laid during the nationalist movement in the late 19th and the early 20th century in India. So people like Dadabhai Naoroji were, already talking about colonial drain theory that Max referred to, colonial and underdevelopment in the form of sort of reconfiguring the Indian economy as a agrarian export production oriented economy, the destruction of indigenous manufacturing industries. But what's really interesting about this kind of analysis is also because deindustrialization was so central for a lot of the economic nationalists, therefore, rapid industrialization became a prominent form of imagining nationalist development in the post-independence period. So emphasizing sort of tariff protection for nascent Indian industry, but also an integrated approach to different sectors in economic policy. However, centering sort of this idea of rapid industrialization and development of technology. Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who I'm going to focus on, was slightly different from most of the economic nationalists at this point, because he chose instead to sort of advocate for restructuring agrarian relations and also kind of advocated addressing the dynamics of indigenous institutions and socioeconomic conditions in the early 1910s to about 1930s. One of the first people to question Eurocentric conception of development. He also put forward this idea of social ecology, which I will talk about in a second, and advocated for enabling the Indian village economy, smallholding farmers and small firms. Was also quite sort of actively advocating for cooperative credit and banking, and also flagged the dangers of excessive centralization and division of labor. Regional planning was one of the ways he thought was sort of the best way to move forward and address the relationship between rural and urban economy, but at a fairly localized level. It's really interesting that he was also talking in this period about restructuring economics as a discipline using comparative and historical methods, and actually wanted to establish a new science of comparative economics, just like comparative religious studies or comparative literature. The social ecology approach to economics was partly sort of in line with also Mukherjee's idea that sociology in general should be sociology and psychology should be informing the discipline of economics more centrally. And he was also quite critical of the British liberal economics and drew on partly on German economics traditions, but also looked at East Asia for thinking about a different way of economic planning. But like I mentioned, ecology was quite central to his thinking. And he also connected it to political consciousness and this idea of regionalism. So it's worth looking at just these couple of quotes that, and he's writing in the Indian Journal of Political Science in 1942. So he says, as plant and animal ecology deal with the complex and subtle linkages between different species of plants and animals, and the processes of uplift of the entire biotic community of the ecological area, so does regional planning deal with climate resources and landscape, laws, customs, economic and social institutions that are necessary to bring about a close harmony and progress of human community in relation to the region's forces and possibilities. And just to highlight in the second quote for him, this idea of regional localized planning was quite connected to also thinking about class conflicts. So he says, no doubt class conflicts in the present political system are an expression of the modern ill-balanced and centralized industrial structure, which with its sudden fluctuations of employment and mass purchasing power, which can be mitigated. In terms of agriculture, he had some very sort of specific ideas. So writing in the 1930s, he wrote this massive sort of work, which was called Food Planning for 400 Million, quite concerned also about population in this particular text. But he talks about adaptive crop rotation, again, specific for each region, intense mixed farming that focuses on smallholders, ceilings on land holdings, but also kind of really emphasizing the idea that the Indian farming system was based on joint family farms and homestead structures, which are actually suitable for cooperative, for grafting on a cooperative business model, instead of restructuring it along the lines of large and capitalist mass production. And then, as I said, he was quite concerned in this particular text also about overpopulation. So he had very specific proposals for family planning and linking it to welfare programs to improve food, nutrition, health, and literacy for mortality reduction. In a slightly sort of different way, the J.C. Kumarappa's sort of program of Gandhian economics gave economic content to Gandhi's philosophy of Swaraj or self-rule. According to Ramchandra Guha, the historian, he can be actually perceived as one of the earliest leaders of the environmental movement in India. And like Mukherjee and unlike a lot of the other economic nationalists, he rejected the idea that industrialization should be the pathway for India's development to recover from underdevelopment enacted through colonial rule. Again, he was quite emphatic on radical decentralization of power, also within the kind of broader framework of nonviolence. So also very skeptical of statist intervention, even of the independent state. And for him, the sort of primary divergence between the Gandhian vision and the socialist ideologies was not in its objectives, but that of its methods. So he was quite opposed to concentration of power in the hands of the state, and also against a narrow conception of nationalism. So again, kind of centering this idea of the village economy and the local and the regional. I'm not going to read that quote, that very long quote again, but it's worth highlighting that he says, it makes little difference whether it's India or England, imported food we should not eat. As political frontiers lead to conflicts, foreign trade is often based on violence. Our attitude is not one of nationalism. In that way, again, he goes on to say, in that way, socialism is somewhat circumscribed, and communism too. They have a certain limited ideology, whereas Gandhiism sort of aims at the development of the human being. For Kumarappa, the history of imperialism sort of illustrated that overproduction of commodities and excessive use of competition for non-renewable inputs generates violence. And he therefore sort of claimed that the path of large-scale industrialization would actually leave no place for a meaningful democracy in India. Again, sort of coming to the issue of labor, which was again quite central to his vision of development. He said self-sufficiency was also an antidote to exploitation of labor and resources, and in a way sort of presaging the political implications of distancing that is enacted through long commodity chains. He writes that under the Gandhian order, if we refrain from using a foreign article, it is because we do not know anything of the article and cannot assess its value and conditions under which it was produced so far away. So if we burn kerosene oil, we become a party to Burmese slavery, as Burma, where the oil comes from, was subjugated to exploit her resources. Employment, in the context of sort of employment, he talks about a living wage that is not conditional on the type of physical or intellectual labor. And again, sort of talks about how trading can be necessary, but only for surpluses or goods that cannot be produced locally. Labor-intensive village industries is sort of proposed as an alternative to alienated labor that is fostered by industrialization and mechanization. And in this quote, he sort of also talks about labor as a means of self-expression and creativity. Moving on to sort of his specific plan and ideas about agriculture. So in 1947, he's the chair of the Congress Agrarian Committee for Reforms, and the committee specifically comes out with certain kinds of recommendations, such as land and tenancy reforms, which includes abolishing intermediaries, giving land to the tiller. Instead of vesting control in the state, sharing of rights and controls between the peasant and a vaguely specified village community, voluntary cooperative farming, reclaiming of wastelands through collective farming by landless workers. And in terms of practices, he talks about low input farming, advocating specifically against mechanization in the context of the need for sort of more labor-intensive forms of industry and farming in India. However, these recommendations were made just before the framing of the constitution in India, and were actually eventually sidelined in the development plans. So this kind of this early period gives us, and through the lens of the writing and thinking of these thinkers who were quite active in the nationalist movement, sort of gives us an idea of the kind of very active political contestations around what development, the direction of development should be. Which eventually in the 1960s sort of gets sidelined more and more with the Green Revolution interventions, like I mentioned at the beginning, partly under sort of extreme pressure from USAID and including from foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, etc. And that story of the Green Revolution now is sort of much more known, particularly because of recent histories that have been written by people like Nick Cullither in particular, and Benjamin Siegel. So now I'm going to briefly sort of talk about R.H. Richarya, who was a rice scientist, and in a way is an exemplar of how these kinds of alternative trajectories were actively suppressed. So Richarya headed the Central Rice Research Institute in the early 1960s in India, leading research that focused on improving indigenous varieties that were high yielding, embedded in farmers' agronomic practices, and adaptable to regional sociocultural and ecological conditions. So in a way, quite aligned with the principles of Gandhian economics that were being proposed by people like Kumarappa a decade ago. He was quite influenced by the practices of Adivasi farmers and advocated for a decentralized research and extension program that worked with inexpensive local resources and also gave local farmers much more control, and was explicitly expressed opposition to factory-oriented farming. However, Richarya's program was shut down and he was removed to make way for the International Rice Research Institute-led draft rice varieties and the HYV, or the high-yielding varieties program. Richarya in this period was actively critical of the Green Revolution model, and argued that they were actually unsuitable for most local Indian environments, which were rain-fed, unlike in situ plant breeding adapted to specific regional ecologies. He was also concerned about the susceptibility to diseases and pests of imported rice varieties, as well as biopiracy and robbery of indigenous germplasm. Richarya refused to actually pass on the collected indigenous rice germplasm to Erie under World Bank pressure in this period. Instead, he called for setting up farmers' rice centers that could act as custodians of local rice cultivars. And just to sort of end with this quote, which is quite similar in terms of its emphasis on a self-generating economy and building up of local resources, he says can offer a permanent solution in rice and not outside support, which would always be limited, conditional, and uncertain. And says, organic and ecological farming with which our farmers are familiar and which they prefer finds little place in our research and planning process after 1965. So I'm going to sort of quickly end with a few conclusions, drawing together some of the common strands in the thinking of these figures, which was, primarily the recognition of the relationship between development planning, idea of what a meaningful democracy could look like, and nation state formation, which was based on this kind of expanded conception of sovereignty, where power was not centralized and concentrated in the state, but was sort of devolved and centered on village economies. Socio-ecological relations were foregrounded in all of these visions, as well as their political implications. But one thing worth highlighting is the relative neglect of caste oppression in the thinking of people like Kumarappa and Radha Kamal Mukherjee as well. They in a way reflect the discourses and practices of contemporary, not just contemporary agroecological struggles, but also post-growth and degrowth discourses, which is now being recognized, particularly in the case of Kumarappa. However, like I said, in many environmental movements in post-colonial India and several agroecology struggles explicitly do invoke Gandhian principles and modes of organizing. However, they also are often complicit in sort of not confronting caste oppression explicitly and how it shapes agrarian labor, which was also the case in some of these alternative imaginaries in organizing. So people like Manu Goswami have, for instance, argued specifically that the program of the economic nationalists was did not sort of address the social question, and the formation of India as a national space post-independence was primarily thought of in terms of economic and in economic and material terms. And I just want to sort of end by reinstating what I started with, which is paying attention to these kind of alternative but unrealized visions and proposals that were articulated in what we can call sort of the more institutional elite indigenous political and scientific sphere, but they were also actively marginalized and suppressed, illustrates how imperial interventions played a role in foreclosing debates on the direction and trajectory of post-colonial development. And but by paying attention to these, we can sort of think about the possibilities of socially and ecologically just development that does center agrarian relations and structures. I think I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and you've been getting lots of questions in the Q&A box. Actually, all of you have been. So I think we have 20 minutes for discussion. So I think what I'll do is pick, the top one, and then I'll throw one of my own in, and then I'll take a specific one for each of you, and then maybe we can do several rounds. And to the audience members, feel free to put more questions in the box still, and feel free to also vote for the ones that you like, because there's already a lot of questions there. So I just wanted to ask, because I thought they were really complimentary actually, and really nice. And so Divya and Max, yours were more sort of on the history of thought side of the whole issue. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you would apply the ideas that you talked about. So for example, with Divya, like you mentioned a lot of concepts that were really interesting. So are there any in particular you'd like to, highlight in terms of what would be helpful for understanding development in India today? And similar with Max and Tunisia. And then for Ibrahim, who's more applied presentation, you mentioned very briefly that there's lots of Palestinian scholars who work on dependency and take this political economy approach. And I will probably email you about that. But if you could just say a little bit about what they say, and specifically maybe how their view of dependency is informed by the particularities of the Palestinian economy. Because I assume that they probably have a sort of a different view than what the Latin American scholars have, or Samir Min. I don't know. It'll be interesting to hear. So those were kind of my questions. And then I think they overlap a little bit with Ethan's question to Ibrahim, but I'll just put it to all of you, which is, so what? And then he followed up and said, well, maybe the question is now what? So that's kind of a general question. And I'll just pick a few of the specific ones. So I think David Barkin's question is for you, Max. What's the difference between a dependency theory approach and that of a critical examination of colonial economic policy theory? And then Ibrahim, you got quite a few questions, but let's take Kai's, since it's the highest up here. He wants you to make the historical restructuring a little bit more tangible. How did the process of stealing land, creating wage workers, and going to work in Israel take place exactly? How did struggles of resistance against this restructuring of the economy, expropriation of land look? Did high wages in Israel constitute powerful pull, etc.? So this is a very big question. And finally for Divya, Sadia Tor asks, did any of these economic figures that you mentioned discuss caste and the impact of the caste system on the village urban national economy? Oh, and then she sees that your last point addresses the absence of caste in these visions. Okay, so if you want to talk about that, you can, or not, we can take another question for you. Where does the Vikalp Sangam movement fit into your examination of professional economists' work? So that's a lot of questions for all three of you. Do you want to start, Max? We can just go in the order that you presented in.
Yeah. So in terms of now what or how would they be applied? I mean, I think those are similar ways of asking a similar question. Right now, increasingly, at least at the level of discourse within the activist movements in Tunisia, there is more and more talk about food sovereignty, which is a practical application using agroecology of a lot of the programmatic or methodological ideas about rural development that I was discussing using Salahuddin al-Amami as an example. I mean, a lot of his thinking essentially prefigured agroecological approaches. In other words, using indigenous knowledge, using traditional knowledge, using indigenous material, building up from traditional farming practices. So how would it be applied concretely? I mean, there are, again, proposals for, first of all, agrarian reform, for restricting export agriculture, for supporting research and development in terms of native development of barley and of other crops, in terms of supporting crop biodiversity. There are not really proposals yet for returning to indigenous methods of water gathering, although this is really going to be extremely acute as global warming advances in Tunisia. So the question is, I mean, of the state and local communities kind of taking up these approaches and also resurrecting what is still relevant from the older work, which I think is above all particularly relevant when it comes to the waterworks, and that's probably where it was most advanced, and applying it to the concrete puzzles of the present, where there are huge crises around water supply, and there are continued crises around the overall agricultural and economic development model, and kind of re-endogenizing it, because it is, the crisis is acute. I mean, most young people or a lot of young people, especially the ones who are capable, are not seeing a future for themselves in Tunisia. So the question is, how can the social formation be re-endogenized? How can it be made more equal? How can the outward flows of value seize, and above all, or not above all, but at the basis of all, how can it be used to protect the ecology, which is a question of using a lot of the methods that are in Amami and just reapplying it to the present. In terms of David's question about how is this similar or different. So there are, I would not say that, I think there are many dependency theories, and Ingrid has written about how we can systematically think about dependency theory as a research program, and De Palma thought about how can we think of dependency theory as the concrete situation of studies of dependency. I think both of those are very valuable, and I also think at a kind of with a different inflection, Enrique Dussel said a dependency theory is understanding the process through which dominated capital is dominated by a dominating capital, or how value flows from a dominated capital to a dominating capital. Basically, how value or the control of what's produced in society, including labor itself, how that flows from a subservient society or social formation to an imperialist one or a colonizing one. So how is that different? I mean, a critical examination of colonial economic policy theory is applying those either theoretical or methodological notions to a concrete context, essentially. So to analyze colonial economic policy, we need, we don't need, but we should have, so we don't fall into empiricism or positivism, we should have a theory that's guiding the examination to say, what exactly do we want to understand about it? And if we want to understand how it is that this process of subjugation occurs in a patterned way, then I think dependency theory is very helpful. I mean, how that differs slightly from some of what was done in Latin America is that Latin America was what was done in the earlier portion of Latin America in CEPAL was much more focused, was still infused with structuralist economics, and there was an earlier, more reformist approach, and it radicalized in Latin America as a reaction to as part of the intellectual reaction to the Cuban Revolution, and also the failures of import substitution industrialization, and adopted a more Marxist inflection, although still in some ways developmentalist in terms of not really turning towards what were the actual technologies of that were producing dependency, which is really what, in different ways, both Divya and I were focusing
on. Okay. Right. So let's start with your question, Ingrid. Right, talking a little bit about kind of the history of thought in terms of dependency theory in the Palestinian context. I guess, I mean, several Palestinian scholars kind of saw the same thing happening during the first 10, 20 years of the occupation from an economic perspective, because what you did witness actually is what you would call individual richness, I mean, well-being, but overall macro kind of destruction of the base of the economy. And that is what they were kind of trying to grapple with. And they were trying to think of, you know, what is the best framework to look at this? And there was a little bit of debate. I mean, until now, you find a debate. I have to say a friendly debate. I mean, listen, there aren't a lot of scholars. I mean, Palestine is a very small community. But, you know, it's a friendly debate about whether, and this is Yusuf Sayer in the 80s would call internal colonialism versus dependency theory. Is what we call the Palestinian economy distinct, demarcated enough that we call it a periphery to the core? That was part of the discussion that was happening. I think the people who, and again, this probably has to do a little bit with ideology as well, people who were more left-leaning, who were more Marxist, really kind of talked more about dependency theory. And I particularly find it very relevant even after the 90s with the establishment of the PA, because dependency theory also talks in one way about the comprador right class. You have a group of people within the periphery that have similar interests with the core. So you have people within the Palestinian economy that have similar interests with the Israeli occupation. You had it before the early 1990s and the political process, and you have it afterwards as well. And so Adil Samara would be one of those Marxists who would push towards that. You have other people, I mean, right now, Layla Farsakh in UMass Boston, who, again, I mean, friendly debate, but would push more for kind of like a colonial, not that there's, you know, they're mutually exclusive, but you have different kind of frameworks that are used that I believe are actually complementary. Now what, or so what was the second part. First part of so what is that we're not surprised. It's almost like, you know, if you dare and watch mainstream TV in the US, you know, you open on CNN and they're amazed, they're flabbergasted what Trump has done. If you have a weak framework, if you have a wrong framework, you're always going to be surprised. So in the Palestinian context, that means you're surprised international aid didn't work. You're surprised these neoliberal policies did not lead to development. You shouldn't be surprised, because looking at it from the perspective of a dependency theory really helps you understand why things aren't working. So that's first, you're not surprised. So what? Secondly, and obviously more importantly, right, this is in terms of policies. So it lets us know that this idea of economic peace that actually Shimon Peres and Netanyahu in the 90s was talking about is not going to work. This idea of having border industrial zones where you have Israeli capital and Palestinian labor, or, you know, you have these common projects, these are not going to lead to any sustainable development. And the same thing, if it basically in terms of policy is telling us there is no development with the Israeli occupation being there. That's the most important one, right? You cannot have development. And so those are the kind of two aspects in terms of so what dependency theory. I think you're not surprised why things failed, and you have an idea about what shouldn't happen, and, you know, and hence what should be done. And finally, the question from Kay, 3 questions together, but let me try and talk about high wages. Yes. And I know for sure that you're not telling me this, but you know, this is kind of what neoclassical economics says, right? I mean, why does one worker move from one place to another? It's a high wage. And again, I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but the best way to deal with that, why I believe that is not simply the case, is by, again, zooming in, dissecting. When we do case studies, don't take a Penn World table of 200 countries and throw them in econometrics and get a result and say that's it, right? You have to zoom in a little bit. So if you zoom in actually to the Palestinians who went and worked in Israel, first of all, you have to look at the waves. So there was an early wave in the 1960s, right? These are people mostly who were refugees 20 years ago, right? These are the people who kind of lost mostly their land, which was their capital in what then became Israel. So these are people who either were not employed anyways or really were wage workers as well. And so that was part of the big wave. But the second wave, actually, the largest wave after the late 60s was late 70s, early 80s. If anybody's familiar with the settler movement in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, that's when it's exploded. And so there's almost kind of a direct correlation between confiscation of land, people losing their lands, and going to work in Israel. Not only work in Israel, I mean, there's not enough time to talk about all of the details, but also working in Israeli settlements within the West Bank. I mean, you have Palestinians who their land were confiscated. In order to feed their children, they had to build houses in the settlements that were taken from their lands in order to have a wage to feed their children. So it becomes much more complicated. But the other point is that you also look at the different sectors of the petty bourgeoisie, the agriculture, the manufacturing, and the trade was. That's what I do in detail in the paper, and try to see how that particular segments of society kind of dwindled, and at the same time, wage work in Israel increased. And so you see that it is kind of this proletarianization that played a role in work in Israel. Yes, and so there was also a question of how Palestinians dealt with this, and I didn't talk about in the presentation, but one very clear time, if people are interested, right? The first Intifada in 1987, the unified leadership of the Intifada, Palestinians who were revolting against the Israeli occupation and its policies, they boycotted Israeli products. They called and boycotted Israeli labor. That's when Israel first started thinking about getting labor from outside of the Palestinian labor force, because they then realized that this impacted their economy. And since then, it has not, right? They boycotted Israeli products, boycotted Israeli work. They worked on cooperatives within the Palestinian economy, house gardens, sharing products with each other. So they had boycotting, paying taxes for the Israelis. A lot of Asyan Madani, what's that in English? Civil disobedience policies or actions that were taken by Palestinians. Now, that went on for a few years. Then the political process and the Palestinian Liberation Organization that was mostly situated outside of historical Palestine kind of took control. This is where Palestinians start getting it gets into a controversial part, but this is kind of what Palestinians did during the first Intifada, which is really focuses what the steadfastness economy or resistance economy, as we called it. So I'll stop here because I took a lot of time. But Divya, you can. Okay.
Thank you so much, Divya.
So I think on the question of what is the relevance of the history of this kind of a political thought for the present, I think in a way, a lot of these ideas are already circulating and being expressed by a lot of social movements and agroecology struggles, even if they're not sort of visible in the statist realm of development planning. And just the kind of diversity in terms of modes of organizing and practices that are visible in agroecology struggles in India that are based in different regions in itself is kind of a manifestation of the kind of emphasis on regionalism and a more localized strategy that people like Kumarappa were talking about. But I think the other thing, though, I would like to mention is that the relationship, for instance, between the idea of the living wage and ecology and non-violence and its connections with localization, I think those linkages and relationships are, I think, quite useful to inform struggles that can sometimes become narrow in their conception and focusing on one thing over another. So for instance, particularly, I think agroecology struggles in India, by and large, still focus quite a lot on small landowning farmers, leaving the question of landless workers out of the picture. And so thinking about forms of collective farming, which is also, which is not to say that there aren't groups that are already thinking about that, but to sort of articulate it through some of this political thought is, I think, can be quite useful in sort of informing those kinds of debates. But the other point that I also wanted to make was, is that in the context of sort of particularly today, where the right in India is kind of appropriating the notion of the indigenous in a very narrow nationalistic form, this kind of history, which kind of thinks about the indigenous and stresses the idea of decentralization and what it means for a meaningful democracy, again, I think is really, really important for that notion of the indigenous to not be appropriated in a very superficial and dangerous way. And just to quickly answer David's question. So I'm not specifically, I don't know a lot about Vikalp Sangam's specific work, but like I said, I think ideas of Kumarappa and Gandhian ideas in general have sort of been taken up quite a lot in environmental struggles. But again, I think it's worth keeping in mind their limitations as well, which is particularly the neglect of caste oppression, which kind of is obscured in sort of valorizing the idea of the indigenous social institutions as the kind of foundations for this kind of alternative organization of production and consumption. And just to briefly mention in relation to Sadia's last point, which is that there were domestic interests that pushed the Green Revolution agenda, for sure. And I think, for instance, M.S. Swaminathan, for instance, was quite who is a scientist, was quite active in sort of enabling that strategy. But that history, I think, is much better known, which is why I think we need to sort of think more about the kind of dissenting voices, which, like I said, have been erased from some of the histories of the Green Revolution.
Thank you so much. So we've gone over time, but this was fantastic. And I think the remaining questions are mostly comments, so I can send them to you after the session is over. And I think we have to end there. So, but thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. It's been really nice to hear such a sort of engaging discussion on dependency theory. And thank you so much to the audience for being so active on the Q&A box and coming up with all these great questions and all these comments and resource suggestions on a Thursday evening in Europe and morning in the US. So the recording will be available on the AHE website. So this is the second to last day of the July webinar series of the AHE. So we have one more day tomorrow, and the plenary tomorrow will touch on some of these same questions. There'll be some discussion on post-colonial theory as well. So please join us. I'll put the link in the chat there. So I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to